Particular session is, as a member of the Scientific Advisory Board, really interesting for me because we're going to give a couple of flavours of, I guess, the really leading edge research that's being done by the HRB-TMRN PhD Scholars, who are all lined up in front of me. These four have been really involved in an awful lot of the work that's been done, and hopefully in terms of the outputs that will be produced and have been produced, and you're going to hear more about them. And then we're going to have Trish from the BMJ give her presentation. So just a bit of a word about maybe my own thoughts from this morning's session. It was very interesting just to see the All Trials campaign in terms of how patient organisations, of which we're going to be one of those patient-led organisations who will be signing up for it, just how the role of patient organisations is changing. Now, we've seen in Ireland that patient organisations have been doing everything from funding research to driving research to getting involved in research to even disseminating research. But the role of them as actively advocating for research is changing, and it's certainly something that my organisation is changing as well, in terms of where we see ourselves in that real spectrum of research that's being developed. And very often for patient organisations, you might hear them most often in the public sphere when they're calling for either access to a medicine or even better pricing. But I guess from my perspective, I'd have to ask the question, well, how can you call for better pricing of drugs without actually asking the question or calling for better research? So from our point of view, that's what we'll be calling for in terms of what we describe as evidence-based advocacy. It's something that we feel really needs to happen in Ireland, needs to get far stronger, and hopefully days like today will assist with that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marina. I think is the first to talk about her project. Each of them has 8 minutes. It's tight, but we have good timekeepers here, and hopefully a good chair as well. So Marina, if you'd like to come up and be first.
Thanks very much, Derek. So my name is Marina, and I am HRB-TMRN PhD Scholar in University College Dublin. What I'm going to be talking about today is some data from my qualitative research project. So I'll first be talking about my statistical rigor, which is my own PhD project, the methodology for that, and an unexpected theme that came out, which worked out well for me. It coincided quite nicely with the theme of this year's symposium, which is transparency in trials, and I'll be talking about different trial phases. So my own PhD project, I'm looking at statistical and clinical data management rigor in trials. So the design, conduct, monitoring, analysis and reporting of a high standard, quality and thoroughness to obtain precise and unbiased results from a clinical trial. So I'm not going to talk about guidelines too much. I'll leave that to the experts in the room. But we just talk a lot about good clinical practice, but not many of us mention GSP, which is good statistical practice, who also call for transparent assumptions, reproducible results, and valid interpretations. And all this, obviously, having transparency as the central theme. So I'm going to be presenting some data from my semi-structured interviews. And the three stakeholders that or my three participants are statisticians, clinical data managers, and principal investigators. So when I started off this presentation, as I mentioned, my central theme was looking at statistical rigor, and all three of my stakeholders, PIs, statisticians, and data managers, have the view that there is a lack of understanding about the importance of statistics, and that we need to put stats at the core of a trial. Because without the data being of good quality, the other work we do becomes irrelevant, because we don't have enough information to prove or disprove our theory. And to me, this is what transparency is all about as well, in understanding the importance of statistics at all stages of a trial. So why do we need rigor and transparency in trials? Well, the reality is that in a clinical trial, it's a matter of asking people to come in. We're asking people to engage in a program, take time out of their daily lives of managing their health to actually carry out activities. So what the PIs have to do then is they have to make sure that trials are done in an appropriate and answer a meaningful question, and they don't expose participants to risk, and we have an appropriate level of support. So I suppose in terms of transparency then, we have to be true to the people who participated. These people are taking time out of their daily lives. We have an accountability, a moral imperative to be truthful and to report the data. One of the things that we have to do is actively make sure that people trust in what we do. And trust and transparency, to me, go side by side. One of the most profound bases of trust is transparency. We have to be completely open about what we're doing. We're only going to get government supporters, get industry to place their studies here, and get patients to enroll if they trust us. So I talked about transparency and rigor and trust, but alongside of this is honesty and integrity. So it's about being honest, being rigorous, and having integrity. So if something can go wrong, you can report it. And I think it was mentioned earlier, the word messy, because by nature, trials, complex healthcare interventions are quite messy, and that's the nature of the business, but we have to report on this messiness. And a statistician shares the same view as a PI here, where they say the credibility, the scientific integrity, it's all in the guidelines. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's all about putting the patient's interest first. So I'm going to talk a little about trial motives and conflicts of interest. So one statistician I was interviewing mentioned that sometimes it is a selfish, career-driven thing. But sometimes, in terms of doing trials and our motives for trials, it's an actual desire to advance medical knowledge. Some PIs, for example, recognize that they need to do a trial for their career progression, with one PI saying they discourage this very significantly. Again, we need to question, are we transparent about our motives for a trial? This statistician likes to see themselves as being objective. We don't have an invested interest, whether a trial fails or is successful. No one asks a statistician how many successful therapies you've been involved in. It's more about how many rigorous trials you've worked on, again leading to the fact that we need to factor in conflicts of interest and financial incentives. Transparency and funding for a trial. So I think there's a lot of this is coming out, but I'm just going to give a whistle-stop tour kind of where I'm at with this. But we all know there's a lot of infrastructure in terms of money in Ireland at the moment for trials. But it's the problem, the lack of transparency here is how the money is allocated within a trial. We all know dissemination is an expensive activity and knowledge translation. How transparent are we about the budget in things like this? Most of our funding goes on personnel and salaries, and little goes on statistical support. And again, from my perspective, looking at statistical rigor, how much do we actually fund a statistician? In terms of trial design, transparency comes in terms of the beginning when you're writing your trial documentation. Protocol or analysis plan, it's to be reviewed by everyone in any way connected from a trial. You've got your clinician point of view, your statistical point of view, and your data management point of view. All of this is making sure you're transparent at the beginning of your trial design. The data managers as well, they have a say in terms of wanting to be involved in the budgeting and the proposal of a trial, because they have key points in how to collect data that could save us time and energy. Transparency in trial conduct. I mentioned I'm no expert in guidelines, but I suppose the purpose of ICH guidelines and etc. is to ensure that there is no drift in our own heads. We want to make sure we stick to the protocol. Again, transparency to ensure the fidelity of our study is not compromised. We need to be sure that we adhere to ethical principles, and we need to be challenging ourselves about what we're doing in clinical trials. Trial analysis, again, going back to the importance of a statistician and knowing they have that content expertise. With one statistician referring to themselves as the guardian of the statistical analysis plan, again, adhering to trial documentation. So I suppose the main aim of this then in trial reporting, it's about recognizing the importance of the questions that we've asked and answering these questions and whether they can change practice or improve patient outcomes. So what transparency means, again, is in terms of being committed to what we can control. Whether it's negative or something that's positive, everything gets published. Whether that's just a mundane paper, everything still gets published. So this statistician believes that in terms of statistical reporting, it's not all about the p-values. Statisticians say they don't really care that much about it. We care about the interpretation. And that, unfortunately, has led to this pressure to publish where people try to oversell their results. And it's not just the analysis part of a trial report or the discussion, it's ensuring that the methods are reproducible as well. And I mentioned a quote at the beginning that said, we need to be transparent to ensure trials are reproducible. Trial publishing then, there's been a lot about this today, but I suppose by nature of us being academics, we do have this pressure to publish. Everyone wants their paper to be published in the highest impact journal. But then that's a quote from a statistician, but the PI similarly says, well, maybe it's up to the journals. They might not be interested in publishing statistically insignificant findings or negative results. And that is a problem because we are losing a lot of learning. With this PI mentioning this is the clinical reality when you set out to do a study. Similarly then, going back to the peer reviews that was mentioned earlier, in terms of statistical peer review, you wonder what kind of rigor we're getting, because statisticians are a drop in the ocean when it comes to all other reviewers. I'm just going to quickly talk about transparency and teamwork in terms of collaborative spirits. We need to recognize that there is value in combined training of multi-professional groups. We need that higher order thinking and higher understanding that statisticians have, because it's about being a master of your trade rather than a jack of all trades. We have people from different areas of expertise in a trial, and it's easy for things to get lost in translation. Again, we need transparency and teamwork here, adhering to people's strengths and limitations. We need to educate people on the full functionality of everyone's roles in a trial. I'm not going to head into public and patient involvement, but just to say that they are equally as part of a trial team. It's about respecting the contribution of the totality of the team. Transparency and communication, then, I've put this in all 4 stages of a trial: the design, conduct, analysis, and reporting. Because, especially what I'm looking at, we need to make sure the medical jargon and the statistical jargon can come together to speak some sort of language, the same language. So that's me, basically. It's just a whistle-stop tour about what transparency means for me in my study. It's the reporting, but it's also the recognizing of the importance of interdisciplinarity, transparency in disclosing conflicts of interests, and transparency in guidelines, documentation, allocation of funding, and frequent communication. I'd like to thank my supervisors in UCD and the HRB-TMRN. And thank you very much.
Hi everyone, so my name is Jessica Power, and I'm a PhD student with the HRB-TMRN, and I'm based at the Centre for Global Health in Trinity College. So my PhD is really looking at scaling up of healthcare interventions, so it works, so what next, and how they're scaled up and adapted for local diverse contexts. But what I found when I'm looking at these case examples of scale-up is over half of them have really indicated factors that relate back to how a trial, how an intervention was initially designed, trialed and reported, really influenced whether it was successfully scaled. So the title of the talk is How to Design, Trial and Report Your Intervention with Future Scale-Up in Mind, which is a big sell for 8 minutes. So I just wanted to really highlight kind of the top tips for success and some reading I found really helpful in these areas, and just highlight the factors that were brought up by the case examples of scale-up. Just to really highlight the knowledge to practice to gap, which has been widely documented. So it's estimated that only about 14% of healthcare research ever makes it into a practice setting. So that's a really small amount. And the timeline for that to happen is really long. So it's estimated around 17 years. I mean, that varies a bit from study to study, but just thinking about a very small amount of healthcare research makes it to practice. And when it does, it takes a really long time period. So we need to think about what we can be doing in intervention design, trial and reporting to try and speed that up and increase chances of success. So in my work, I'm looking at case examples of scale-up, and in my PhD, I have 27 case examples of scale-up internationally on a range of interventions of behavioural interventions, sexual reproductive health interventions, maternal child health interventions. But when I talk about scale-up, what I mean is a purposeful, active expansion of a healthcare intervention to a wider population group. So the intervention can be a new intervention or just new to that context. It's different to, I suppose, spread or diffusion, which is more of maybe seen as a passive approach where something is replicated, maybe the same thing is replicated, where scale-up really looks at the complexity of the different contexts where an intervention is to be implemented, and really looks at how the different strategies and adaptations need to be made for those different contexts. So I'll talk through the tips for success that have been highlighted through the case studies that I found, and I'll break it into designing, trialing and reporting. So to start with designing an intervention, one of the main problems that keeps coming up is that keeps being mentioned is that scale-up is an afterthought. So that when people are designing an intervention, they're not really thinking about future scale-up. So that can be anything to do with producing really high resource interventions that will never have the money or resources to roll out in real world settings without the funding of a trial surrounding us. Often there isn't the recognition of the future need to adapt, that there needs to be flexibility built into interventions. And these interventions are going to be scaled across incredibly diverse contexts if they're successful, and there needs to be flexibility built into that. And kind of leading from that is, if the theory of the intervention is well articulated and we know why the intervention is the way it is and what are the essential components of the intervention, that will help us know what we need to keep in place and then what outside that can be flexible. That came up really strongly across over half the case studies that I've been looking at. So really thinking about when you're designing your intervention, what is my intervention and what is the underlying theory? So that can be psychological theory. So it can be, we think because of social learning theory, a certain behavioural intervention needs to take place in a group setting. Or it could be physiological theory. My background is as a physio. So thinking about if it's different exercises, why does it need to be done at a certain frequency, duration, intensity? Is it to a muscle fibre change happening at a certain rate and time? So just thinking about what is the theory behind it, and then what do I need to do to enact that theory. I think if you can be really clear about that from the beginning and know your intervention really well, everything else will come a lot clearer in all the future steps. So really taking the time to do that. In the literature, there's a lot of language to describe the same thing. So when they're talking about the theory of an intervention and then the kind of essential components to enact that theory, you'll find language around core components, core elements, mechanisms, actions, and they all mean virtually the same thing. What is your theory and what is the essential piece that you need to enact that theory? So the top tips for success for designing the intervention. So begin with scale up in mind. Think about if this is to be rolled out in settings which don't have a lot of resources, will my intervention actually ever make it to scale? Think about what is the theory of the intervention and the mechanisms, and then think about what is flexible and adaptable. So what can future sites, what do they need to implement, and what can be flexible and they can adapt. Some reading I found really helpful, so these slides will be available, so if anyone wants to read more, I found those references really useful on that area. Moving into trialling the intervention, I think if you design it in a way that you really know what your intervention is, know what your theory is, and those essential elements, trialling becomes a bit more clear, but then we need to make sure that we maintain fidelity to those elements. Are we actually testing what we think we're testing? So building in a good fidelity measure to the trial, so that when future implementers look at a trial, that they actually know that if you're saying something is essential and I need to keep it and I can't adapt it, that you've actually trialed for that as well. So in terms, fidelity is notoriously rarely measured, and when it is, it's measured poorly. But there are resources out there to kind of help fidelity measurement. So some references there. So for, say, behaviour change interventions, the National Institute for Health have, the Behaviour Change Consortium have a fidelity framework. Only last year, Perez et al. Put forward the modified fidelity framework, which is really useful. So it kind of gets you mapping out what your intervention theory is, what your essential elements are, what's the adaptable periphery, so what is adaptable, and then within your context, what you think might moderate that. So they're really nice resources to use to just help map out your fidelity and your fidelity planning. So tips for success, be really sure that you want to know what you're trying to measure, what are you actually testing, and that will lead you to what methods you think you're going to use. And then making sure to build in a fidelity measure. If we're saying something is essential, we have to make sure that we're actually measuring it in our trial as well. And then moving on to reporting. So we've spoken a lot about that this morning. So this is just a statistic from the Research Waste series in The Lancet. So actual reporting of trials that do report, the reporting of interventions themselves, of what was actually done, is really, really poor. So they estimated that 40 to 89% were non-reproducible. So if somebody was to pick up that study and say, I'm going to implement this intervention in my setting, we actually wouldn't be able to reproduce it. And with my background as a physio, I can't tell you how many studies I've picked up that have said exercises. What exercises, for what body part, for what duration, for flexibility, for strength, exercises for 6 weeks, 1 hour a week. So I just put those aside and they never get implemented and they go into that research waste pile. So really thinking about really reporting on what is our intervention. So the Tidier guidance came out a few years ago, and this is an extension of the consort statement for reporting on randomised trials. So this is really nice, and it can be used again in your design phase, not just in the reporting phase, just to really be thinking about what is my intervention, why I'm doing it. They even have a section on tailoring, so if you are adapting parts of your intervention throughout your trial, that you can report on that. Just again, on the theme of transparency, it makes it really transparent, being really, really clear on what we did. But something else that's come up in my case examples of scale up, again, in over half of the case examples, they've really talked about this knowledge sharing piece and thinking of knowledge sharing also outside of the peer review. So the peer review reporting needs to happen. We need to have that in place to say it worked. But really local sites, particularly around a lot of sexual reproductive health interventions, often are implemented in community organisations, and they just want more information. What is this intervention? Something that's a bit more accessible than a peer review. So things that people noted that were really helpful were guidance documents, manuals and toolkits, web-based platforms with more information on the intervention and the intervention theory, and some technical assistance that was available. So really in this day and age, when we can make information so accessible online, when you're developing your intervention, be thinking about how can we also share that knowledge with future sites in a really accessible way. Somebody talked about academics moving on from jobs as well. So do this now before you move to another job, and then it's up there as well, so you don't need to be thinking about it afterwards. So then top tips for success for reporting the intervention: make sure to report it, make sure to give details, use reporting guidelines, and really be thinking outside the box a bit about how can you knowledge share for future sites to help that implementation process happen. Just some reading I find helpful is one example of an intervention that did that knowledge sharing on a web-based platform is a CBITS, which is a psychological intervention in the US for trauma for school-aged children. And it's just, you have to log in for it, but all the resources are free. And it's just a really nice idea of how you can set up an intervention online for sites to have more information. And they also obviously did the peer review publications as well. And then future reading will be my PhD, hopefully next year or the year after, so keep an eye out. The next stage is really focusing in on this knowledge sharing piece, just to see what factors can really help influence success of this knowledge sharing. So to conclude, when designing, think about your theory and your mechanisms. What is your intervention? Always be thinking about future scale-up and embed that in your design. When you're trialing, think about fidelity. If we say it's essential, we should be doing it in our trial and measuring it. And when we're reporting, make sure it's transparent, it's really detailed, so we know what exactly was done, and then be thinking about how we can share the knowledge. And just to say thanks to the TMRN, who've just been such a great support through this PhD process, and my supervisors, both in Trinity, Fred Valliere, and in UCD, Eilish McAuliffe, who helped organise today, and Hashim Manon, who have been really, really helpful through the whole process. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, my name is Caroline Hurley, and I'm based in University College Cork. So today I'm going to look at risk-based monitoring, and I suppose where we are in Ireland in academic-led studies and where we need to be, so some recommendations. So just some background, my PhD is looking at the implementation of risk-based monitoring into Irish academic-led clinical trial units. So I'm looking, I suppose academic-led, you're looking at the Clinical Research Facility Cork and the CRF in Galway, and also the facilities in Dublin. So as Derek said, I have a number of supervisors, so there's a big team involved in helping me with my PhD. So again, why risk-based monitoring? So anyone who works on a clinical trial will be familiar with ICH-GCP, and you'll all know that as of June 2017, the new GCP regulations came into effect. So ICH-GCP has been there since 1996, but in June 2017, it's just kind of an updated version and some new addendums. And in particularly, they asked sponsors to now develop a systemized risk-based approach to clinical trial monitoring. So ICH-GCP always recommended that trials were monitored, but in the new edition, that was actually came into effect in 2017, they now want sponsors to do risk-based monitoring. And I suppose, what is risk-based monitoring? So if you, just according to ICH-GCP, so it's their description of risk-based monitoring is a monitoring plan that uses on-site monitoring, it can use centralized monitoring, it can use on-site and centralized monitoring. But whatever a sponsor decides to do, they need to justify their decision in a monitoring plan. So I suppose this is where we stand with ICH-GCP. It's quite vague. It does give you some overview of what risk-based monitoring is, but it doesn't kind of set out a clear path on how we can do risk-based monitoring in our clinical trials. And I guess this kind of vagueness and uncertainty around how we implement risk-based monitoring, that came the need for my PhD, and that's why I'm looking at how it's being implemented in Ireland. So I suppose stage one of my PhD was to actually find out what is risk-based monitoring. So, and to do that, I conducted a systematic review, which was published in 2016. And what I was looking at these risk-based monitoring tools. So stepping away from ICH-GCP, a number of other organizations they made some work and they have put effort into defining what risk-based monitoring is and setting out guidelines on how we do risk-based monitoring. So they have developed these risk-based monitoring tools. So when I'm talking about a tool, I'm talking about paper-based questionnaires, there's some web-based applications, and they have two functions. First of all, they give you some guidance on how you should assess the risk in your clinical trial. Sorry, I'm just getting some hints down the back to move closer to the mic. And Secondly, they give you some guidance on how you should then monitor those risks. So when I'm talking about risks in a clinical trial, you're looking at stuff like the study drug, the phase of the study, the location of the study. Then you're looking at the study team. So how experienced is your study team? How is the drug stored? You're really looking at the overall risk of the study, not just the study drug. So that systematic review has been published, if you want to read it. So in total, we identified 24 different risk-based monitoring tools. And I'm not going to go into them, but what was really useful from doing the systematic review was actually getting a really good overview of what risk-based monitoring is. So in a nutshell, there's 4 phases really involved in a risk-based monitoring plan. So stage 1, which is vital, you need to assess the risk in your clinical trial. So how do you know what to monitor if you're not sure where the risks lie? And ideally, you would do this when you're developing your protocol. So you kind of want to catch things before you put it in for HPRA or ethical approval. And again, this is it's a full team activity. So clinical trial, there's a broad team involved. You study nurses, you PIs, pharmacists, monitors. You need really everyone to sit down and do a risk assessment and identify risks. And some risks you can resolve. So maybe you can just stop it there. It doesn't need to be written into the protocol. And then, so phase 2 then is looking at the risk and categorizing them. So what can you resolve before you go any further? Or maybe there's some risk. So there'll be always a risk with a study drug. So you just need then phase 3 mechanisms. How do you monitor those risks? So does it make more sense to do on-site monitoring? So maybe it's a new study team and you feel like the study team needs a lot of on-site monitoring. You think someone needs to go on-site to make sure that everything is running smoothly. Or maybe you feel like this is a big multi-center trial, we'll do everything centrally. So we'll just send all our data into an ECRF, an electronic data capture system, and we can monitor essentially. So we don't need to go on-site to monitor those risks. And then finally, with risk-based monitoring, it's not a once-off event. It needs to be systematic. So most clinical trials will run for, I say, a minimum of 2 years, and some run for considerably longer. So obviously, the risk profile will change as you collect data on the study. So maybe there's more SAEs than you had initially thought when you did the initial risk assessment. So now, do you need to look at different mechanisms to control those risks? Do you need more on-site monitoring? Do you need more centralized monitoring? So I suppose in a nutshell, they're kind of the 4 phases involved in risk-based monitoring. And I suppose what I'm here to discuss today is what are we doing in Ireland in the academic-led trials? Sorry, I keep jumping. So to do that, I conducted a mixed method study where I wanted to look at the barriers and facilitators to risk-based monitoring in Ireland. So this paper has been recently published. So it was a mixed method. So the first phase involved a qualitative survey that I distributed in 2015, which was followed up then by qualitative interviews of a subgroup of people who took part in the survey. So, and I just want to thank everyone as well who did fill out the survey for me, because I thought the response was quite good. In total, we had 132 different clinical researchers who replied to the electronic survey. So, and we had a number of different roles in the clinical trial. So we had PIs, study nurses, biostatisticians. So this is really important because in a clinical trial, everyone should really know how the study is monitored, and they should know where the risks are and why you're doing different activities. And some results that came from the survey. So, and apologies, I think some of my numbers are a bit off, but over a third of participants had conducted risk-based monitoring, which is brilliant because I did the survey in 2015 before the new ICH GCP guidelines came into effect. And I suppose, but maybe just the final point, a lot of participants felt that they didn't have the expertise to conduct this risk assessment. So that's very important because you can never do risk-based monitoring unless you know where the risks are within your study. So the next phase of this trial was to do the qualitative work. So for that, I had a subgroup of different participants who took part in the survey. So again, I had PI, study nurses, statisticians, a really good overview of everyone who would work in a clinical trial. And some barriers, it's just a lack of knowledge, lack of training. People aren't sure how you do risk-based monitoring. Again, people felt that this big emphasis on centralised monitoring, that would increase their workload, particularly staff who worked on site. So they felt that they quite liked when a monitor came on site and looked through paper records themselves. They didn't need that much input from the staff team or the study team. But they felt that if we're going to move towards centralised monitoring, does this mean that, for example, study nurses now have to upload all consent forms, all documents? So where does the work lie in centralised monitoring? And again, so in Ireland, there's a number of academic studies that are quite small, very low budgets. So they do things paper-based. So they weren't ready yet or didn't have the budget to move to IT systems. And again, I suppose there's nothing to say that risk-based monitoring works. It's new, and I think there'll never be a gold standard. But so this came up as well. People weren't sure that it was as good as what they're doing now, because now it's very intensive, a lot of source data verification monitoring that was conducted in the units. And just some facilitators, of course, you have to do it. ICH GCP wants you to do risk-based monitoring, so you can't avoid it anymore. Again, just the idea that more training would help people implement risk-based monitoring. And some people felt that there would be financial benefits. So in particular, if you're doing a low-risk study, some people felt that they could reduce the amount of monitoring they're doing. So this, in a way, would reduce the money they spend on monitoring. I suppose just some recommendations from this study. We obviously need more training on risk-based monitoring, and I know the HRB-TMRN have run a number of webinars in this area, so that work has been done. And finally, we need to look at this risk assessment. So if we can't do, we first need to get the first phase right. So how are we looking at the risks in our clinical trials? And I think a one-size-fits-all won't suit, because even that jigsaw that Sandra put up earlier, there's so many different clinical trial units in Ireland, and they're all they have different populations, they look at different drugs. So I think maybe this needs to be more localised, kind of in-house SOPs looking at the risk assessments. And I suppose just some recommendation, going back to the systematic review, I did identify these 3 risk-based monitoring tools that are really good. And if anyone's deciding or trying to develop their own SOP for risk assessment, I would advise looking at these 3 documents. They're free. And in particular, Transcelerate are kind of leading the way in risk-based monitoring at the moment. So they might be documents to refer to. So there's some references, and thank you very much.
So I'm based in NUI Galway, and when I started my PhD, I started the process of implementing an initiative called Evidence Rounds. And the aim of Evidence Rounds is to disseminate evidence to healthcare professionals and to promote evidence-informed practice. So it was a multi-component strategy, and I suppose the main part of it was group sessions that were run. And our setting was in University Hospital Galway in the Women and Children's Division. So here are just some photos of the sessions, and basically what would happen is the HCPs would be asked for clinical questions or topics that they needed more evidence on in order to treat their patients or to update guidelines or whatever else. So I would go away and do a little search, and then I would do an initial screening phase, so I could come up with hundreds or thousands of citations. So then I'd narrow it down to maybe 40 or 80, pass it on to the clinicians, get them to choose the particular resources that they felt best fitted with what they needed for their practice. And then we get 3 presenters. So it was interprofessional, it was multidisciplinary. So we had people from obstetrics and neonatology, we had medical doctors, we had nurses and midwives. So the first presenter would always present the international and national guidelines. The second presenter would present the systematic reviews, and the third presenter would present the RCTs and the observational studies that were relevant. After the session, that took an hour, we always had a 20-minute or 30-minute session, which was really useful, and it was a kind of an informal discussion section. So the staff would be able to discuss among themselves, okay, we've seen the evidence, do we need to change our practice, do we need to update a guideline, write a new guideline, and we'd pinpoint certain actions that might come from the evidence, and then we would assign duties to specific staff just to get the ball rolling. There was another component of evidence rounds was this dedicated website. So it was really good for acting as a repository. So once the presentation was over, people would still have access to the evidence. If a certain person was not working that day or wasn't able to make the session, they would be able to refer to it later. There was sources on the website if you wanted help with searching for presenters, critical appraisal resources, and there was also a section where different issues came up, like there was difficulties around understanding of p-values and confidence intervals, and I was able to put up articles to help staff understand that, and it was optimized for mobiles and iPads as well. I did 6 sessions with them over a 9-month period, and there was 87 unique attendees. And what I mean by that is that many of the attendees came back for multiple sessions, so the numbers are more than that. And there was 18 presenters. So I decided that I'd write a paper, and I was thinking about what I might write about, and it was actually around, a lot of the evidence would say that you really need a year in order to evaluate something like this. And also, when you evaluate an initiative like this, it might work in one site very well, and then it might not work in another site. And why is that? It's because of the context and the different contextual factors. And so I wanted to investigate this more, what was the context for my target population. So I asked them. So I ran some focus group and interviews, and we had 13 participants in those, and we got some very rich data. My data analysis used the framework approach. I'm not going to go through that, it'll take too long. So I will be publishing a paper soon with that, and there's another paper as well describing the implementation process of evidence rounds. So if somebody else is going to implement a similar initiative, that might provide guidance for them. So from the data analysis, 5 key themes, or I suppose domains, emerged. One was the organisational readiness for change, the barriers and facilitators to attending evidence rounds, the barriers and facilitators to presenting evidence rounds, the communication and dissemination strategy, and the sustainability. So as you can see, it's all very pragmatic, and it's all about the practice. So just in the next section, I'm just going to use the words of the participants, and I'm going to use some illustrative quotes using these 5 key themes or domains. So evidence rounds was very, I think, concise, and all the documents were there. I think it gives us a much better overview of things, and it certainly has led us to question our practice. And the one thing that jumps to mind was the medication pre-intubation. I mean, we currently use morphine and atropine and pancurium, and we know it led us to go away and think, well, should we be using fentanyl? Evidence rounds was very good for making us all think about our practice and how we can improve it. Are we doing things safely? Are we in keeping with national and international evidence supporting best practice recommendations? Another participant said, at the last meeting, it raised a lot of questioning. And we all think we're all doing the same thing, but the last meeting showed that we don't really do the same thing. And that came to light as a result of the discussion section after the evidence was presented. And that's definitely changed practice, because now we are bringing it in. So this was just one of the topics, timing of umbilical cord clamping, that was discussed at an evidence round. And we're discussing it, and we're aware of it, and it's coming on the new neonatal guidelines. So that's going to be, it was great to have that evidence to know whether we wanted it or not. The progress and the changes will be slow, but the awareness is there. It's just down to actually getting the work done. So evidence rounds kind of begins that process. Next, the barriers and facilitators to attendance. I know it's not easy because of staff constraints at the minute. There's a lot of leave not being replaced and all that it is difficult to release people, even for their mandatory training. And therefore, they find it very difficult to come to other training. So evidence rounds was voluntary. The consultants needing to attend and show the interest, because here nothing happens unless they show that. If the consultants support it, certainly they'd get all their Regis and SHOs on board, because they'll do anything that they tell them. And from a midwifery perspective, if the managers are on board and encouraging, I think that's the main thing. So after the second session, I started giving certificates of attendance and participation. If this is a way of people getting their credits, then it is automatically attractive to everybody. And we all know the last one is true. Okay, so barriers and facilitators to presenting. I have a big interest in the topic, and also there were concerns raised clinically about, and I've just taken out the topic there for confidentiality. So I thought, here's the big opportunity, and I'm glad I did it. Next participant. I don't think I could see me doing it. No, I would not be able to stand up in front and present. Even though I do teach a course, even just when I was sitting there, I said, oh, there's no way I would be able to stand up there and do that. I don't think I'd have the skills to do it. I wouldn't be really proficient with, the technology. So that just shows you the range. The communication and dissemination strategy. So someone had said, that's one of the great challenges within our organization to try and share information. I think there needs to be very strict boundaries within which WhatsApp would work. So here I'd asked about the possibility of using text or apps like WhatsApp. So they said, I think our group is going to constantly change, so you may be missing out people who'd otherwise attend it. You may be constantly texting people who may need to be removed from the group. Some people get very annoyed if they're on a day off or if they're not working on shift and they're constantly getting these alerts, so that's fair enough. And one of our professional issues we set for ourselves is no use of mobile phones in the workplace, so that came from the midwives. So of the formats of communication and dissemination, there was two that everybody liked, and one of them was the posters that I used. So here's just a view of them. The posters are very good as well. A lot of people are very visual in terms of taking in information, and if they can see something, they go, all right, okay, yeah, I must remember to go to that meeting. I think a printed sign is useless. I think you need to have some kind of picture on it, because people are drawn to images and pictures and bright colors. So going back to the website, just looking at the analytics, there was 196 unique visitors, so I actually caught more people than what came to the sessions, and then 346 visits, so that means that those visitors were coming back multiple times, and 928 page visits, so that means that they were clicking onto more than one page. So very easy to navigate, a good repository, and then the other extreme, I would not be a typical person because I'm not really a most enthusiastic researcher, and that was from a clinician that avoids the internet just in general. So finally, sustainability. If you have people whose professional role it is to provide education, it works well. We are lacking that type of person on our end of things, so that's why these things run for a period of time and then they just kind of fall apart. The biggest thing I got out of it was the multi-professional involvement, because we do a lot of our training and updating ourselves in separate capacities, even though yet we work together and care for the one woman in front of us, but we're coming at different angles all the time. So I think it's hugely important to bring evidence rounds forward and even incorporate it in more and more in our training, that we're working together, we're updating our skills together, we're training together, and as a result we're caring for the woman together. And the final quote, seriously, I think it's one of the best things that's happened in a long time for advancing our practice in education. So I know I'm running out of time. So basically, overwhelmingly, the main thing that people, when they were asked what they got out of evidence rounds, was the opportunity for an interprofessional and multiple disciplinary approach, which doesn't always happen, even though obstetrics and neonatology, that there's so much in common, the mother and the baby, but it wasn't always possible for them to collaborate. Also, the multiple communication dissemination formats. I thought email would be very popular going in, but it really surprised me. It wasn't with a lot, and especially in the HSC, a lot of the nurses and midwives wouldn't even have a HSC email, so that was surprising. And finally, the participatory approach. So I had run a similar initiative over for the NHS in the UK, but going into University Hospital Galway, nobody knew me from Adam, and they were absolutely brilliant. I couldn't have done it without them. I involved them right from the planning process and right the way through. And I didn't want to superimpose what I'd been done in the UK on them. So I was very adaptive in my approach, and I was constantly asking for feedback well before these focus groups and interviews ever took place. So I'd like to thank all of them. They're an amazing team, amazing people to work with. And just some acknowledgements, and thank you very much.